And so as we come toward the end of the book of Revelation, this revelation of to John from God, showing or opening out the ultimate end of any worldview that's void of God. It's interesting that one thing we notice with John's vision is it now switches from the visual. Remember, John had said, then I saw. And in this chapter, it now switches to the auditory, then I heard. And here in chapter 18, we see these three angels. We assume that they're three individual and separate figures, and we're introduced to them in verses 1 and 2, verse 4, and verse 21. And we see in very vivid description the impact and effect of the downfall of this godless social, political, and economic system. And we see the call again woven through this for God's people, as Jesus puts it in John's Gospel, to be in the world, but not of the world. And as we look at this chapter, as it details God's judgments, so at first glance, we notice three things. Firstly, we'll see that John draws heavily from the Old Testament. A lot of what he writes here in chapter 18 would reflect very much of what we would call or term judgment texts from the Old Testament. And the first of those is Ezekiel chapter 27, as Ezekiel then sort of foresees the downfall of Tyre. And the other chapter would be Jeremiah chapter 25, where Jeremiah sees the outpouring of God's wrath upon the nations, and he describes it as the cup of God's wrath poured out. And so we see how what John writes here draws very heavily upon some of the Old Testament sort of judgment motifs. The second thing we notice is how John develops one upon the other, and we see the themes repeat themselves and build as these three angels speak. And then thirdly, we see how these three visions, the three sort of dialogues from the angels, how they build upon some of the key themes that we've already seen in the book of Revelation. The fall of Babylon, the calling out of the saints, and that sense of shock and lament from the inhabitants of the earth. And looking in a little more detail, we see within this sort of rolling crescendo of spoken vision, we see two main themes. And the first is one we've seen through the whole of Revelation: judgment upon the godless world order. Now remember, for John, as he writes, this sort of godless world order is Rome. And we've seen already how John uses the term Babylon and the great prostitute interchangeably with Rome. And so he's using these two terms. They're not different. They're often seen as one in the same. And he sees that as Rome. Rome and Roman rule dominated much of the then known world. Rome had built its empire, and it had conquered and crushed many nations as it drew them in to and enforced upon them Roman rule. And it made its wealth from them, from the grain from Egypt through to trade from Africa, everywhere. It drew in wealth, but it also made people wealthy. Those who could see the opportunity, who traded in these goods, became wealthy themselves. And when Rome fell, and it's interesting that Rome's downfall was caused by internal problems, not external defeat. When Rome fell, all that was lost. And so it's something of this that John foresees. And in verses 1 to 4, John sees and reminds the congregations of these 7 churches that this godless system is evil. It promises so much. It's tempting, it's attractive, and yet it will mislead with promises which are ultimately empty. And then in verses 4 to 20, we're introduced to this second angel, and the second angel starts with a call to the people of God, and it ends with a call to rejoice, to call the people of God to come out, but then to rejoice. And between those 2 references to the people of God, we see the shock of the merchants and the traders who were drawn in, who succumbed to this promise of everlasting wealth and security. Those who were merchants over land, those who plied their trade on the sea, those who were so convinced that this system could never fail and are so shocked that it has. And in verses 21 to 24, we see this third angel, and the third angel shows us in more detail what we heard in chapter 16, if you'll remember, as the 7th angel poured out its bowl, we had the words, "It is finished." And as we go through the commentary from this third angel here, excuse me, in chapter 18, we see the constantly repeated phrase, "Never again." Never again will this be done. Never again will this be heard. And again, it presents us with the challenge to consider as we try to work this out for our own day. What does this mean? And as again, we've already seen in chapter 16, I think this calls for wisdom. What is the social, economic, political world order or world view that exists today that may pay lip service to religion, yet is void of God, that promises much, that keeps us drawn in as we search for that promise of personal security and increasing affluence? What is this world system that we see around us today? And God's word reminds us it will ultimately fail because its foundation is not upon God. And John reminds the people then and us today too, our true self, our true worth and purpose are and can only be found in God through faith in Messiah.